This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.
Welcome to How to Get Started with OneLogin Workforce Identity, Part 2. So first, let's look at how users can be created and updated within OneLogin. OneLogin actually really makes it easy to add users to the cloud directory. You can create and update users by syncing with existing directories like LDAP, Active Directory, or cloud directories like Google Apps, or even HR systems like UltiPro or Workday. You can, of course, add and update users manually by going directly to the OneLogin admin UI. You can even do batch imports or updates using CSV files. And if none of the built-in methods work for you, you can manage users through our API. It's just really important to understand that you don't have to choose just one method for getting your users into OneLogin. Some users might be coming from Active Directory, some from Google, some might just need to be manually created. Once they're in OneLogin, the same security settings can apply to them. The same apps can be assigned to them. You need to simply figure out what works best for your organization. If you already have a directory like Active Directory, Directory Services, and want to continue to use it for particular functionality, go ahead. Create your users in Active Directory as you normally would, and they can then be synced into OneLogin using our Active Directory connector. Do you have some partners that use Google or contractors you don't want to give accounts to in Active Directory? Well, sync with Google. Create those users manually. Fine. Once they're in OneLogin, you can assign them to the apps that they need access to. You need to carefully plan out how your users are created and updated because the information needs to be accurate and up to date. It affects a lot of other functionality. User information can be used to automatically assign users to, say, security policies, which determine how a user will log into OneLogin. For example, are they required to use MFA or no? You can also use user info to automatically assign them to applications within OneLogin. We use what we call mappings to perform these types of automation tasks. For example, we could say that if a user's department field equals sales, they'll get assigned to a Salesforce role, which in turn assigns them to an application like Salesforce. We automatically create users within applications using a feature we call provisioning. And through provisioning, we assign users entitlements or permissions within the applications themselves, as well as copy their user info into that application. When a user is assigned to an app, provisioning will automatically kick in, creating them and copying their info into the application. We can say if the user's job title contains manager, we want them in the Salesforce manager role within Salesforce. We then use what are called rules to do this type of animation. We'll talk more about these mappings and rules later on in this course. All right, since how a user is created and ensuring their user information is accurate and up to date is of the utmost importance, syncing with existing directories is often a popular choice. So let's take a look at how some of those directory syncs might flow before we get into specific how-tos. Some directory connectors are simply used to get users into OneLogin, either as part of an initial setup, or they might stay in place if you want to continue using the other directory as your source of truth for user information. The Azure AD and Google Directory connectors are prime examples of this. These connectors are simply used to push users from Azure AD or Google into OneLogin. If you want to provision users into Google or Azure AD, You would then use the actual app connectors like G Suite or Office 365 V2 app connector. It is important to note here, however, that the Azure AD, you cannot have both the Azure AD directory connector and the Office 365 V2 connector connected to the same domain in Azure AD at the same time. This is because of how Azure AD handles creating users in federated domains. You can learn more about this in our Configuring Office 365 App Connector course. Other directories that OneLogin can sync with can be used to authenticate users as well. Active Directory, Directory Services, again, often referred to as just Active Directory, and LDAP directories are prime examples of this type of directory. Users can be created and updated through directories like Active Directory, then pushed into OneLogin, so they have their user accounts in OneLogin as well. Then, when they go to log into OneLogin, OneLogin can actually forward the auth request to the directory, and as long as the user is successfully logged into the directory, they can get into OneLogin. With Advanced Directory feature enabled, users can be both created in Active Directory, then sync to OneLogin, and they can be created in OneLogin, then sync to Active Directory. When you implement connectors to HR directories, you're allowed to then have new users created as part of a regular HR workflow. A new employee might come on board, and someone in HR creates an account for them in your HR directory, like Workday. From there, the user and all their information, like their job title, department, whatever, can be replicated over to OneLogin. So now the user is automatically created in OneLogin. It is important to understand that HR directories don't provide authentication like Active Directory or LDAP does. Some of the HR directory connectors, like Workday, actually can do a two-way sync. Thus, a user can also be created in OneLogin and then pushed into Workday. Again, remember, HR directories don't do authentication. If you want your users to actually authenticate with a different identity provider, such as Google or perhaps another OneLogin account, then you can use our Trusted Identity Provider feature, part of Advanced Directory. And if you're using a Trusted Identity Provider, TIDP, you can configure it so that when a user logs into OneLogin for the first time from the TIDP or external IDP, they'll automatically get created within OneLogin. Now, what do you do if you're using an HR system or just some other system that OneLogin doesn't currently have an out-of-the-box directory connector to? Maybe you have some custom database that you use to manage your users. Well, one answer might be to use our API and write your own code to handle the integration. However, we now offer our Universal Directory Connector, and you can use it to design connections with other types of directories and OneLogin. Comes as part of our HR-driven identity feature. You can even create an end-to-end flow such that new employees that are created in an HR directory, like Workday, they first come on board, and then Workday Directory Connector clicks in, syncs them over to OneLogin, and then, because you configured OneLogin to push users in Active Directory, the user is automatically created in Active Directory as well. So you can sync users with multiple directories. Hopefully now you have a better idea of what some of your options are for managing how your users are created and how you can get that up-to-date user information into OneLogin. Make sure you can figure out what will work best for your organization before you start. How do you want your users to be created? How are they going to get updated? Is there a single source of truth for user information? And will the source of truth be OneLogin or another directory? So, quite a few options, obviously, on how to create and update your users within OneLogin. We aren't going to go into depth for each one of them in this course. However, we will demo a few of the most common methods so you have an idea at least of what will need to be done. You can find details on how to do all the different tasks that we talked about within our knowledge base. So, no matter how you decide to get your users into OneLogin, you will need to make sure you have the user fields you need to copy into those applications or even to design those automations we talked about. Every OneLogin account has the same standard fields: first name, last name, email, username, phone number, manager, company, department, and job title. To create a new user, first name and last name are required, and either email or username are also required. With Advanced Directory, you can create your own custom fields. Again, you might want to use these fields to base your automations off of, or just to use them to populate user fields in the applications you're going to be connecting to. But remember, the fields will only really be useful if that user information is up to date and accurate. So, let's first take a look at how to go and add in some of those custom user fields. So, if we want to add in custom user fields, easy enough, underneath the users menu, custom user fields. You can see I already have one here, state or region. Need to add a new one. Click new user field. Give it a name like country. The short name here is used, say, in importing in a CSV file, which we will talk about. You do custom underscore attribute underscore the short name, so it could be country here. Also used for macro attributes when you are doing any sort of mappings or rules. Again, we'll talk about those pieces later on, but we'll just create it now and save it. And if we go to look at any of our users, like Mr. Blake Hat here, we will see he has both a country field now and a state or region code, and we can go fill it in, again, manually. Even more better, sync it from an external source. Adding a user manually, which we already looked at a couple of modules ago, is of course quite easy. In the OneLogin admin UI, go to Users menu, then click on the New User button. And here we have a new user record. So first name and last name are obviously required and clearly marked as such, but email or username are also required. Once you fill in this information, then your users are still going to need a password. So you need to save the record, and you can either set their password for them by going to the More Actions menu and selecting Change Password, or you can go to the More Actions menu and choose Send Invitation, and they'll receive an email with a link that they can use to set their own password. I know we already showed you how to create a user manually when we created our super users, but just in case you missed it, let's take a look again. Okay. Most logical place to start to create a user would be handy dandy users menu. Just click on the users menu. It'll get me to the main users page. And if you notice that new user button in the upper right hand corner, that's probably a good guess as to where to start. And we are required to type in first name, which is going to be Fire in this case, and his last name is going to be Wall. So funny. So Mr. Firewall at demo.com. So again, first name, last name, absolutely required, and then email or username are required. So one or the other you need to specify in order to save this user. It'll basically yell at you if you forget email or username. It just doesn't tell you about it in the UI itself. Once I've saved the user, then I can, again, if I'm going to be manually modifying this user, start making some changes to the user, and we'll put him in the sales department. So we can fill in the rest of the fields, including those custom fields, and save those changes. CSV import functionality is useful if you just have a list of your users and you want to create them quickly in OneLogin. Or perhaps you want to get off an older system, and this might be a real quick way of migrating those users to OneLogin. You access import users by going to the More Actions menu on the main users page. You use this import new users, or you can update a bunch of existing users. There's a sample file you can download that has the standard attributes in it. You download it, then you can add any column, say for custom attributes, and of course, populate it with the necessary user info. Remember, import process can be used to update a bunch of users, as we already stated. The trick here is that OneLogin is matching users based upon their first name, last name, and email. If it finds a user that matches, it treats it as an update. If there's no match, it'll create a new user. It's also looking at every single column provided in the CSV file. So if you don't want a particular field updated, like phone number, company, group, role, as you can see here, you're going to want to delete them. If you don't delete them, that is, and you leave them in and they're blank, then it will clear whatever the existing value is for that particular user. So let's take a look at how to import a few new users. So order import users via CSV. We're going to start over the user's main page here. Only got one user so far in this particular account. I'm going to select import users from that More Actions menu. I'm going to download a CSV template. Take a look at it here. You can see it's got my standard fields like first name, last name. Let's increase this a little bit. Username, etc. And then it's got some placeholder columns called custom attribute _1 and custom attribute _2, etc. And these are for any custom user fields that you've created. So I only have one custom user field in that account, that OneLogin's law firm account that we're going to import this into. So what I would do is delete these last three columns. I don't really need them, and I'll just modify this column. And in the magic that is doing demos, look, it's already done for me. So I already have CSV file here with all my handy dandy users. They work at a law firm, so they have great names like Aki Quittle and Admissible. And obviously company is in here. We've got their department, we've got job titles. And over here is that custom user field. So the user field is named state or region, and its short name is state_region. So over here, I name the column custom _attribute _state_region and fill in those values. So all filled in, just need to make sure that it's saved. And I'll close this guy, and then I'm going to go and upload it via nice little dialog that I still have open, and click the import button. So it can take a while to import these guys depending upon how many users you have. So you can actually go and watch its status by going to the activity menu over here, selecting jobs, and I can see, woohoo, it was successful. It completed in the amount of time that it took me to describe that. You can see actually I did an import over here and it had an error. So at that point, I was able to go look at the errors, and it told me that the file contained some special characters. It didn't like the apostrophe that I used in the OneLogin, so I replaced it with more standard apostrophe, and it worked out fine, as we can see. And if we go over to our users here, voila, all my beautifully imported users. Most folks choose to synchronize with an existing directory, as we've already gone over. The directory connectors that we mentioned, such as Active Directory Connector or the Workday Directory Connector, can be found under the user's menu, Directories. If you don't already have a connector configured, you just need to choose the one you want. If you already have a directory connector configured, you would see a New Directory button. Make sure to read through the knowledge base articles related to the connector you want to use. Connectors, like the Workday connector, can be a bit complicated to set up depending upon whether you want to set up a one-way sync or a two-way sync. A large percentage of our customers use Active Directory directory services, aka Active Directory. So we will use that as our directory connector example here. Keep in mind, each directory connector is configured differently, so you always want to find the KB article and make sure you're following the correct instructions. So integrating with Active Directory involves installing what we call the Active Directory Connector. It's a piece of software that's actually installed on a domain controller, or probably better plan, on a member server. It's part of the domain that you want to sync with. It synchronizes user data as well as authenticates a user against Active Directory when an authentication request comes in from OneLogin. In fact, you can have multiple connectors installed in the same domain or forest for failover and load balancing purposes. When you choose the Active Directory connector from the list of directory sources, the Active Directory Setup Wizard will start automatically. You can download the software for the ADC directly from here by clicking on that big blue rectangle. Once the MSF file for ADC is downloaded, you can run it. Click Run, Next, then check the checkbox to accept the license agreement, and click Next again. When prompted for an installation token, you can go back over to the OneLogin admin UI where the Active Directory Setup Wizard is still open. From there, you can copy the installation token and then paste it into your installation wizard. The next step in the installation wizard is for creating or specifying a Windows service account that the ADC will run as on the server you're installing it on. If you choose the first radio button, Create OneLogin Service Account, all you need to do is specify a password. The installation wizard will automatically create the user account in Active Directory for you and make that account part of the domain administrators group, though you do need to be running the installation as a user that has permissions to do so. If you choose the second radio button, Run Service As, then you need to make sure you've created the user account ahead of time in Active Directory and granted it, at minimum, read directory privileges within Active Directory. If, for example, then you wanted users to be able to update their Active Directory passwords from OneLogin, that service account would need the permissions to be able to update user passwords. Or, say you want to enable provisioning from OneLogin into Active Directory. Then, that service account needs the ability to create, update, and delete users within Active Directory. After you select and create the domain user that will be used for the service account, the installation wizard will confirm the port you can use for Windows Domain Authentication, which was previously known as Desktop SSO. 880, fine as a default. This is used internally, so it's not like this is a port that you need to have open on your firewall. The shard selection is then related to wherever your OneLogin account is actually located. So is it located in a data center in the United States, or is it located in a data center in the EU? If you're not sure, ask your account rep. Click Next, and you will see a page that just tells you to click Install. Depending upon the version of the operating system, there might be a warning in between. Don't worry, just select, click Install. When the installation wizard is complete, you can simply click Finish. You can also check that checkbox that says Launch Domain Configuration and then click Finish. The Domain Configuration tool allows you to do a little fine-tuning as to who's going to be synced into OneLogin. So you can filter at the domain level or or you can filter at the Windows security group level through that domain configuration tool. When the ADC service is up and running, you'll see a change over in the OneLogin admin UI in that Active Directory setup wizard. It will move automatically to the import users step. From there, you again have the ability to do a little filtering as to who exactly is going to be synced with OneLogin. Here, you can choose, again, domain level or an organizational unit or organizational units, OUs, that you want the users to be synced from. Once you've selected the OUs or domains that you want, simply click the Finish button. Now you should see the new Active Directory connector instance that you added. So users are synced real time from Active Directory to OneLogin anytime a user is created or updated within Active Directory. However, when you first set this up, you need to do a manual step in order to do an initial sync of all the users that you want to come from Active Directory. So that means you need to go to the More Actions menu and choose Synchronize Users. Also, it is best practice to actually have multiple Active Directory connector instances, meaning that you want to install that Active Directory connector software on more than one member server. To do so, just click on that plus button towards the right-hand side. Make sure to give it some sort of name. Server name works nice, so at least you can find it later on. And then select the new connector instance you've added here, in this case the ADC2 that currently says disconnected. In the pop-up, you can now download the software onto the new member server and basically configure it just as we did in the last few steps. When you're done, you will see you have a brand new connector instance and it is all connected up. Now notice, only one of those has a check mark underneath user sync. That means only one connector instance is actively handling the user synchronization process. The other instances are handling authentication requests. So authentication requests can be load balanced across multiple instances, but the sync process needs to be configured so that it can automatically fail over to another instance if the primary one goes down. Remember, you can also set it up so that users created in OneLogin can be pushed into Active Directory or even into an LDAP directory if that's what you have set up. It's a bit more complicated to set up and not quite as common, so we're not going to go into all the details here. Once a user is synchronized with a directory, we'll be able to see which directory or even directories they're synced with on their user info tab under directory details. There are also several fields here that are automatically populated depending upon which type of directory they're synced from. Active Directory actually utilizes the majority of these fields, such as SAM account name, user principal name, distinguished name, and that member of field down at the bottom. Member of actually contains a list of the Windows security groups that a user belongs to over in Active Directory, and the security groups are listed using their distinguished name. These fields can all be very, very useful when it comes to setting up mappings or other types of automations. If the user had come from an LDAP directory, we would have seen the UUID attribute filled in there, and we would have seen their distinguished name as well. All the other directories basically are using external ID. And of course, there are quite a few other options for getting your users into OneLogin, as we already mentioned. Again, we've got several out-of-the-box HR directory connectors that you can configure to have it set up so that when your users are created by HR within those directories, they will be automatically replicated to OneLogin. It's a great way to ensure that the user info within OneLogin is accurate and up to date, since it is one of the responsibilities of HR to keep that information accurate and up to date within their own systems. That way, you don't have to worry about having the wrong department or job title filled in for your users. You can depend that your automations will work as intended since they have the correct information. Also, don't forget about Trusted Identity Provider and its just-in-time provisioning option. In order for it to work, users would have to be created in whatever that external IDP is, say like Google Directory. Then you need to configure OneLogin to trust that external IDP, meaning add the external IDP as what we call a Trusted Identity Provider. Once the TIDP has been configured, then the user will see something like maybe a tile that will connect it to OneLogin. When they click on that tile, they'll get automatically logged into OneLogin. And if it's the first time that they are clicking on the tile, they will automatically be created in OneLogin as well. That's that just-in-time provisioning piece kicking in. Then when you go look at the user record within OneLogin, you'll see a Trusted IDP attribute on their Authentication tab, and you can see whatever Trusted IDP they happen to be utilizing, in this case, Azure AD. We also have our Universal Directory Connector. Again, purpose of the Universal Directory Connector is to give you an option if we don't have a directory connector pre-made for you. Okay. We're able to create connections to over 1,000 different SaaS applications. And idea is we can simply match up fields from those directories to fields within OneLogin, copying that information over when we create the user within OneLogin, and or with advanced workflow, maybe transform that data a bit, put two fields together, use a little string concatenation there, or maybe take values out of some of the fields that we don't want to end up in OneLogin. Once we do whatever is necessary, either just matching the fields or possibly transforming the data along the way, then the user will be created over in OneLogin. Again, remember that Universal Directory Connector, it's part of the HR-driven identity feature. Advanced workflows, that's a little extra on top of that. And finally, if you want to handle all the connections yourself, you want to basically customize it on your own, transform the data on your own, we do have a full user API that you can use to connect to OneLogin and thus deal with the data however you want to. Finally, keep in mind, you can also use multiple directories to manage the same user. So your entire user management flow could look something like this. A new employee comes on board, HR creates an account for them within the HR application, like Workday. Workday is, of course, set up to sync with OneLogin, so the user is replicated over to OneLogin, and then, through, again, some little more complex configuration, I can configure OneLogin to push into a directory, like Active Directory. So, only manual task here was creating the user originally in Workday. Everything else was automatically managed by OneLogin. All right, so we finally completed that first major step of figuring out how to get users into OneLogin. But do not want your users logging in yet. First, we need to make sure that they are logging in securely. This concludes part 2 of how to get started with OneLogin Workforce Identity. Please continue on to part 3.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.